Okay, good evening. So here we go. We're continuing what happened at Sinai. This is class number 3. Last week we talked a lot about, what the Torah describes that the Jews heard God speak at Sinai, but it's a little bit ambiguous as to what they heard. Well, let me rephrase that. It seems to indicate that they heard all 10 commandments from God, but there are different understandings of that, and we explored the different opinions as to what exactly they heard, what level of prophecy they were able to attain. Was it possible for just regular people to suddenly attain prophecy? So that was the subject of the second class. For anyone who missed a class or wants to go back, I'm putting them up they're on YouTube, and a link to them from the Links website. So linksgw.org. And there's a video tab, and I can't promise that I'll actually keep it updated, but if you go there, you'll at least see some videos in that. Then if you get to YouTube, if they're up there, you'll get to the next one. So anyways, this is only the third class. I also put up the Journey to Virtue classes on there. Those are linked. So if you want to learn what we review or go back and take the Journey to Virtue, so those classes are there as well. Okay, so as promised, is Sue here? Not yet. Okay. Well, Sue was excited that we were going to talk about the Kuzari. So as I mentioned last week, we have to spend a little bit of time discussing what's known as the Kuzari principle. And it's an idea that attempts to prove that the revelation at Sinai and the miracles that are reported in the Torah that occurred at Har Sinai, in the desert in general, and in Egypt, that it's a principle that attempts to prove that it must have happened. Now, before we really get into it, just want to make a couple of important points. Number one, when we attempt to bring what's viewed as some as a proof, we may not see it that way, and that's okay, because this doesn't have to be the basis of our entire faith. This one attempt to prove that something happened, whether we're able to prove it or not, whether we're successful today, does not have to determine whether we continue to have faith in it or not. Personally, the idea that we'll discuss it supports my faith, but I think primarily because I already believe in the Torah being given by God, at Mount Sinai. And that's important, I think, though, even to have supports to our faith, to sort of be able to show that to show to ourselves that it's provable or probable, at least, I think is very, very significant, very important. Whether we can prove it absolutely or not, it's okay. We don't have to necessarily prove it absolutely. Will this principle be able to convince someone who doesn't believe that all of a sudden they hear this, and they'll start to believe? I think it's unlikely, because there are questions that can be posed, and it takes a little bit of of certain assumptions, which means it's not a blanket proof. Again, I think some people will say that it is, and some people will argue that it's not, and there's a lot of discussion about it. But I think we should know what it is, what the idea is, and explore a little bit, and then be able to decide for ourselves how we feel about it, if it supports our faith, if we can just ignore it, cast it away, it doesn't make a difference to us. That'll be up to each individual. Again, though, when we're trying to prove a case in general, so there's never there could be, but it's not just one piece of evidence that proves something. We often take different pieces of evidence and put them together, and we come out with a clear picture in the end. So for example, in a courtroom procedure, they want to convict a murderer. So just finding his fingerprints at the scene of the crime isn't going to be enough to convict a murderer. Just finding a weapon similar to one that this person happens to own is also not going to prove it. Finding a motivation is not enough on its own. Having seen the person is not enough on its own. But when you take all of these things together, right, his fingerprints are there, he owns the weapon that seems to have been involved in the crime. We find a motivation. He was at the place at the time, right? You put all these pieces together, and now you have what seems like undeniable proof. So the same would be true when trying to build a case to prove, let's say in our case, that the Torah was in fact given at Sinai. So, and God spoke to the Jewish people at Sinai. It wouldn't be one piece of evidence. It would be an attempt to try to find different pieces of evidence and combine them. Tonight, we're really going to be focusing on one idea primarily, but sort of, juggling it and looking at it from different angles, hopefully. Now, personally, as I said, my faith doesn't come because of this principle. I wasn't taught this principle when I was 5 years old and said, okay, this is why you should believe in Judaism, believe in the Torah, believe that God gave us the Torah. I believe in it because that's what I was taught as a child, and that's what my father told me, and his father told him, and his father told him. I should say my parents and their parents, and I know my father didn't lie to me. I know his father didn't lie to me, and it goes back generation after generation. Each child, each generation will feel that way. Now, of course, it's possible that at some point someone lied to their child. It's possible. It's very unlikely, I think, but it's possible. But even putting that aside, it's possible that somebody just was tricked or made a mistake, right? That's possible. It could have happened. And now it's as you expand out and talk about more people and more families, then it becomes unlikely. But obviously, this alone isn't enough because there's many faiths out there. They're not all correct, but all of them have a chain of generations going back where each parent told the child that it was true and wasn't lying to them because it's what they believed. And that's true for many religions going back to a certain point. And there's a point where a religion starts, and that's really where you have to key in on and decide, try to figure out where it started and how it started, and then you can examine that. And that's part of what we're going to do is try to examine, where did Judaism start, or if it, if it didn't start at Sinai, how is it possible that it could have started somewhere else? So that's one thing. The first, area where I think my faith comes from is that that's what I was taught. That's what I've always believed. Secondly, is that I believe in God, and that again I was taught that as a child, but I continue to believe that from observation. And when I look at the world, I see God in the world through observing the creation, nature, how unbelievably complex and amazing and the systems and how they work and how everything interacts with each other. So I could look into nature and I can see God. Philosophy supports and experience in my life where I've seen God's hand. So all of these things help me to believe in God. And once I believe in God, so I then philosophize. If I believe in God, then I believe God created the world. Then why did He create the world? It must be He has a will for the world, and if He has a will, He must have revealed that will at some point. And that also supports my faith that at some point that God revealed His will. And for me, that's the giving of the Torah. And number three, I think, besides for that, this is what I was taught. Besides for that, my belief in God leads me to faith. But lastly, I've studied, studying Torah itself leads me to believe in God and that the Torah is divine, because I've experienced for myself the divine nature of the Torah, the depth of its ideas, the eternal ideas that can be found there, despite being thousands of years old. They're still relevant. It's boundless. It's full of secrets. It's full of hints and this and that, all kinds of things that just through Torah study itself, just the moral advancement of it, the moral, the concepts that have existed in it for just, way ahead of its time. So all of these ideas help me with my faith that in fact the Torah is divine. The Kuzari principle, which we're going to discuss, is an attempt to prove it with a principle. And that's what we're going to get into. Now, we should note that although many refer to it as the Kuzari principle, we find it actually in earlier writings already of Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon was a rabbi, I think, in the 900s, so in the 10th century already. He wrote a very similar idea, but often it's referred to as the Kuzari principle. So let's take a look. What's interesting is it's not even so clear, not so explicit, even in the Kuzari. But let's bring it up on our screen and let's take a look. So here we go. So the Kuzari, first of all, was written, if you look down here, originally written in Arabic. It describes how the king of the Khazars, an Asian tribe that converted to Judaism in the 8th century, in an attempt to determine which is the true religion, invites representatives of each of the 3 major religions to come and explain his beliefs. Now, whether this actually happened or not is not clear. I think many believe that the story is invented by the author to bring out his points. He wants to bring out in the way that the book is written is in conversation. So that helps. There's a question and then an answer, and then a challenge and then an answer. The group includes a Muslim imam, a Christian priest, and a rabbi. The king is won over by the rabbi's arguments, and during the ensuing dialogue, the rabbi demonstrates the superiority of his faith by bringing clear proof to the biblical account of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, explaining the commandments in rational terms, etc. So that's the Kuzari. It's written, I forgot to include that, by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Judah Halevi, I believe in the 11th century. So it's an old work, not too far after Rav Sadia Gaon. And he writes as follows, and he's dealing really with the question in the course of his conversation with this king. He introduces his God as the God who I think he introduces it as the God who took us out of Egypt. And in explaining that, why he used that term, the king challenges him. Why don't you say that your God is the God who created the world? Why are you saying that your God is the one who took you out of Egypt, took your people out of Egypt? So he writes as follows. He says, God also revealed himself to the Jewish people at Sinai in the same manner. That the way that I'm introducing my God to you is the way that God introduced himself to the Jewish people at Sinai. He says, the first of the 10 commandments is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt. He did not introduce himself by saying, I am the Lord your God who created the world and you, which may have made, might seem to us to make more sense. It seems to be the greater act. Forget about that. He took the Jews out of Egypt. He created the whole world. He created you. Isn't that the greatest thing? So many commentators note this and wonder why that's how God introduces himself to the Jewish people. And the answer of the Kuzari and others is the reason why is because the fact that God took them out of Egypt was indisputable for them, right? When God says, I am the God who took you out of Egypt, well, they understand who that is. They were there. They experienced it. If God had said, I'm the God who created the world, well, are you sure? We weren't there to see that who created the world. You're claiming to have created the world, but we never experienced that. We weren't there, but they were there for the Exodus from Egypt. So the fact that God took them out of Egypt was indisputable. That's why God introduced himself to them that way. And then he writes, the divine revelation at Sinai was also an indisputable truth, which they personally witnessed and experienced. They experienced it themselves. Consequently, the unbroken tradition of the oral law, or just what he means is our tradition that the Torah was given to us and what the Torah is, was as valid to them as something they had seen with their eyes, to them and to their offspring, meaning what he seems to be saying. Again, it's a little unclear. It's not and this is, again, they refer to the idea as the Kuzari principle. This is what I saw quoted. I saw one other line quoted that might have been what they're referring to, but this is one of the things that I saw, and this seems to be where he lays it out. That the idea is that something that was personally witnessed and experienced is indisputable, and therefore the tradition that they experienced it is as valid to them as something they had seen with their eyes. When we're told by our parents, let's say the second generation, that after the revelation at Sinai, that next generation is told that their parents experienced this, so that was indisputable to their parents. Their parents knew what they were saying. They knew exactly what happened to them. And so the children see that as a valid and strong tradition, and absolutely true. Now, again, it's not so spelled out here, like what's so great about this. And it's actually a little bit unclear to me. What did he like? What's the novel idea here that's introduced by the Kuzari? But all of a sudden, more recently, we have a lot of discussion around, again, I don't know where it originates, that this is the Kuzari principle, but more recently, there have been articles written discussing back and forth whether this type of proof is a good proof. And it's put into different words for us, which I think will kind of help us see what we're dealing with. What is this principle? Because I don't see such a principle in the words of the Kuzari himself, but others do. So that's what we're going to talk about, is what they see in this principle. And before we get into it, before we see how they present it, so let's just lay out a few introductory ideas. So first of all, we have a chain of tradition going back, thousands of years, who believe that the Exodus, that we have an entire, large Jewish population. Now, some don't believe, but most do, or many do. And going back, the further back you go, everybody used to, believed it. And over time, things, people start to lose faith. But going back, we have a chain of thousands of years where we believe this, and we believe that the miracles in Egypt took place, and the Exodus, the miracles in the desert took place, and God spoke to the Jewish people at Sinai. We have thousands of years of tradition of believing this. It's not just Jews who believe this. It's also Christians and Muslims. Christians just believe that it happened. They just believe that their faith replaced Judaism later. And Muslims believe actually that I think they believe Christianity replaced Judaism, but then they replaced Christianity. But all of them agree that it all started with Judaism, and it started with God revealing himself to Israel at Sinai. So we have billions of people whose faith believes in this. And of course, there's people who don't believe it, but that's not the point. The question that we have to ask is, where did this belief originate? This belief that God gave the Torah at Sinai, where did it start? And there's basically three possibilities. The three possibilities are, number one, the belief arose because it actually happened. And that's the one that I believe. The reason why we believe that these miracles happen and that God appeared to the Jewish people at Sinai and spoke to them and they all experienced prophecy is because it did. That's where the belief arose. Number two, it didn't happen, but someone managed to convince an entire society at some point that it did happen. That would be option number two. And again, can't rule it out. Maybe someone, a charismatic leader, whatever it was, at some point convinced a large group of people that it happened. And number three would be, it didn't happen exactly as we say. There was nothing miraculous about it. Something happened, like maybe there was a volcanic eruption, a thunderstorm or something. They thought that God was speaking to them, but he wasn't. And over time, the story changed and the myth emerged. So it wasn't like a sudden thing that someone once showed up one day and convinced everyone, but maybe over time, the idea developed. Those are, I think, the three possibilities. Maybe somebody can think of another possibility, but I think this basically covers it. Now, within number two, you have to, there's different possibilities of when that happened, meaning it could have happened what would be called present theory, that they were told at the time, at Sinai, that something was happening that wasn't really happening, or past theory, which means that someone came later and said it happened in the past. So we'll have to examine those two possibilities. But let me share with you two of the current Torah scholars who have written a lot about this idea. Are number one, Rabbi David Gottlieb of Or Sameach in Israel, and he's engaged in a lot of debate because he wrote something and then people responded and he defended, and he's very clearly defending what he calls the Kuzari principle, and that's where I'm going to base the idea of the Kuzari principle off of. And I also really we'll make sure to get into Rabbi Lawrence Kalaman's presentation. Rabbi Kalaman authored a book, he had a number of books, one of them Permission to Receive, which is about the revelation, and I've never read the book, I don't have the book, but he has enough articles online that I think you can find his views, and we'll see, I included a link. He has a great class on this, which I highly recommend that you listen to, because he's much funnier than I am, and also very, great presenter. So let's get into it a little bit. So here we go. This is how Rabbi Gottlieb defines what he calls a modern, updated version of the Kuzari principle. He says, let E be a possible event which, had it really occurred, would have left behind enormous, easily available evidence of its occurrence. So if you have an event or a potential event, that's what we're considering, whether something actually happened or not. But if it had happened, it would have left behind enormous, easily available evidence. So then we would say, if the evidence does not exist, people will not believe that E occurred. Now, if people do believe that E occurred, then there must have been evidence of it. In other words, again, let's just do it because it's a little bit. So again, we have a possible event, which if it would have occurred, there would be enormous, easily available evidence of its occurrence. So, and if there is no evidence, then nobody would believe it. So if people believe that an event that would leave lots of evidence occurred, there must have been that evidence, and that's why they believed it, right? Okay. So the way Rabbi Gottlieb presents it is, he says, let's say someone's trying to convince you of something fictitious, something that didn't happen, but he wants to convince you that it did happen, but it's something that would leave a lot of evidence. So let's say you live in Silver Spring, Maryland, and someone wants to convince you that last week, a great earthquake occurred, and it shook, all the buildings, and many buildings fell down and crashed to the ground. So if something like that had happened, well, there would be evidence, right? And if there's no evidence, then I know that it didn't happen. I would not believe it on its own. If I can't find evidence, and there should be evidence, then I won't believe it. That's a very simple version of this law. Now, in order to apply it to our case, we have to assume that there would be evidence of such an enormous event having occurred, and if it's not there, then it couldn't have occurred. Now, of course, when you make such a rule, there's always going to be exceptions, right? There will be people who will believe things, despite the fact that there's no evidence. But we're going to see it's not so simple. But what's important here is this point: is easily available evidence. If there's easily available evidence, then nobody will believe it without first checking the evidence, right? If there's not available evidence, this is going to be an important point, then people might believe it because they can't check it anyways. So then I could believe it. But if I could check it, then I'm not just going to believe it without trying to verify it. So now, of course, people throughout history have believed all kinds of things that are, crazy. Or so for example, people used to believe in dragons, or at least so they say that people believed in dragons. Now, doesn't that show that you can sell anything to anybody? Somebody would believe in dragons, flying dragons that breathe fire, right? So can you could, people are very gullible. So you could convince people, but the truth is that doesn't fit into this principle, because what did people believe about dragons? So Rabbi Gottlieb says, I'll tell you what they didn't believe. They never believed that a dragon marched into downtown London in the middle of the day, burnt hundreds of people to death with its fiery breath, knocked over buildings, and then drowned in the river. They didn't believe that. Why not? Why didn't anyone believe that? Nobody told that story. Nobody said that that's what happened, because if somebody had tried to say that that's what happened, but nobody would have believed it, because there would have been very, very available evidence. If such a thing would have happened, they would have been able to check it, and they would have found that there's no evidence, and they wouldn't have believed it. So what stories did they say about dragons? So they said, Sir Galahad, he comes riding in from the forest. His armor is dented, he's bruised and bleeding. And they say, what happened? What happened, Sir Galahad? And he says, oh, I had an encounter with a dragon. So, well, maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. There's no evidence either way. If it did happen, there wouldn't be enormous evidence, because it's basically just his word. So people might believe it. That's fine, but they can't check it. So it's not, it doesn't fit the principle. The principle has to be something that will have easily available evidence of its occurrence. And if that evidence doesn't exist, then it wouldn't be believed. Now, again, we'll have to decide if the Sinai revelation, at whatever time somebody would have tried to present it, would fit into this or not. And that's going to be something to determine. One more point I think about this. The really important point, I think, is what I just stressed before, is that the audience, in order for the principle to apply, the audience has to have access to the evidence. And if they don't have access to the evidence, then they might believe it without checking, because they can't check it. So many situations, a lot of anti-Semitism, for example, is, people say all kinds of things about, the Jews this, the Jews that, right? But it's all like, the secret societies, they control everything from the back. It's nothing that could be actually verified. That's why people could believe such crazy things, because, blood libels, all these things, all these crazy ideas, people believe crazy things, right? But that's because you can't check it. Nobody says that the Jews openly do this and that, because they won't, because that nobody would actually believe that. They say it's secret, it's behind the back, it's so then it's believable, because they can't actually check it. That's key in understanding this argument. To go a little further, so when Rabbi Kalaman discusses it, so he talks about, he calls it's a similar principle. He calls it smart lies and foolish lies. So he says as follows. He says, and this is the link. It's also in what I emailed to you. So it's an article, and there's a video there of a class about an hour long, and it's awesome. You should listen to it or watch it. It's actually I think it's on YouTube, but the link is there. So he says, anyone who has studied history will affirm that people are gullible. We consistently find that sufficiently charismatic leaders can persuade people of any lie, even a lie that obligates followers to engage in painful or self-destructive behavior, as long as followers cannot check the lie. Lies that cannot be checked or validated are smart lies, insofar as they are maximally seductive. However, claims that can be checked, foolish lies, tend to be tested and rejected, especially when the lie obligates followers in unpleasant or suicidal observances. So there's So he's basically making the same point. He calls it smart lies and foolish lies. Smart lies are lies that cannot be checked. He says those are maximally seductive. Claims that can be checked are foolish lies. Rabbi Kalman talks about the Heaven's Gate cult, which was a cult it began in 1980, I think, started by a fellow named Marshall Applewhite, who was a very, I guess, charismatic or convincing person. And he apparently convinced his followers that he was an alien who had originally moved in and taken over the body of Jesus prior to Christianity's finding, and now the alien had now taken over the body of Marshall Applewhite, and he had a whole thing that they needed to do. His followers, he had many followers. They had to buy Nike shoes, all sorts of crazy things that like made no sense, and it was all about also like, you know, not connecting with the world. Lots of cults are like that. You have to cut off, you know, everyone from their families, and but ultimately, he convinced his people in 1997. There was a comet that was passing by. The Hale-Bopp comet was passing near Earth, and he convinced his followers that he revealed a prophecy that he had, that there was a spaceship tailing the comet that was coming to pick them up, and all they would have to do to escape this world and move, you know, and it was called Heaven's Gate, to move on to the kingdom of heaven, you know, and to move beyond this world, all you had to do was tie a plastic bag over your head after drinking a lethal dose of phenobarbital. And one night, they had a mansion that they rented, this cult, 39 people committed suicide and attempted to ascend to the spaceship that would be picking them up. And this happened in I forget if the last part was, I think it was in California, the whole thing. I'm not sure the last part. But anyway, wherever it was, the point was that this was a lie that can never be checked. And that's why he was able to convince them of it. He didn't tell his followers that there was a spaceship, the spaceship that had dropped off your parents is now coming to pick you up, because then they could have picked up the phone and called their parents and asked them. I mean, a lot of these people were all ages. They were all adults, but of all ages. They were all educated people. They all had, every single person had a college degree. Many of them had advanced degrees. All of them were considered normal before this. None of them had records of any psychological or mental issues, but people could be convinced of things. And somehow he managed to convince them, but only because it was a smart lie. It wasn't something that could be verified. It was something that cannot be verified. And the truth is that all religions, except for Judaism, all begin with, you know, this type of scenario, which we could call potentially a smart lie. Because all religions basically begin with one or two or a couple of people having a vision and then sharing it with their followers. So Buddhist writings speak of Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who had a solitary ascendance through the 8 stages of transic insight, whatever that means. But he had his own, you know, prophecy and then shared it. And Muhammad had prophecies that he shared. That's where Islam comes from. And Paul met Jesus on the road, and Jesus revealed to him whatever, you know, things, and then later we have, you know, even more recently, very recently, in the last couple hundred years, we have the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, where Joseph Smith Jr. is going for a walk in New York State and finds, you know, is met by an angel, and then he finds tablets that reveal like a new version of Christianity, new ways, Mormonism, and it was him, just him and one other guy maybe, but you know, there's never a group, there's one person. It can never be checked, it can never be verified, and that would be something that we would consider, you know, a smart lie, because it's not something that anybody can actually verify. If I tell you, my friends, thanks so much for coming to my class, it's the perfect day because just last night I had a prophetic vision and to start a new religion, and this is it, right? So you may not believe me because I'm not so charismatic, but if I was very charismatic, you might believe me. And even very, obviously it doesn't matter how smart one is, they could still believe something like that. But the point is that it can't be checked. That's true for all religions except for Judaism, perhaps, which again we have to examine. But the first thing is that we are not claiming that one person had a vision, one person had a prophecy, and then shared it with anyone else, which is absolutely uncheckable. The claim is that everyone experienced prophecy together at the same time. And by everyone, I mean close 2 to 3 million people. That's the claim. The 2 to 3 million people went out of Egypt. That's the claim. And again, depending on, we have to entertain. Again, we have 3 possibilities. Either it happened, or somebody convinced people that it happened, but it wasn't a very smart lie because it's checkable, seemingly. We'll have to talk about that. But or third is the myth formation, which we'll talk about, where it slowly develops. So the way that Rabbi Kalaman approaches it is he says there's basically, in the second category, where we will say that a charismatic leader came and convinced everyone. So there's 2 possibilities. He calls the 2 possibilities Moses theory and Fred theory. Then they're basically present theory and past theory. Present theory is, as he explains, here we go, Moses theory and Fred theory. If we contemplate what the scene must have looked like when a false claim of national prophecy was first launched, we find ourselves locked into one of 2 scenarios. The person making the claim either told his followers that the national prophecy happened in the present, you heard God speak, or that the national prophecy happened in the past. Your ancestors once heard God speak. He says, let's call the first theory Moses theory, since the Torah records that Moses was the name of the Jewish leader when the prophecy took place. So if it was present theory, if it happened in the present when the Torah claims it happens, so that means that's Moses theory, that Moses came to the people and said, you heard God speak, when really they didn't. That would be present theory. And then past theory is what he calls Fred theory. The second possibility, Fred theory, since the leader during this post-Sinai period need not be Moses, he might as well be Fred. So that's why he calls it Fred theory. So now he says, let's break it down. So Moses theory. So why is Moses theory improbable according to Rabbi Kalaman? Why is it improbable or impossible, perhaps, that Moses came to them and said, something happened, you experienced prophecy. So he says people would probably know if they had heard God speak. And if they hadn't heard God speak, they might be a little hesitant to accept the Torah's validity. So if Moses comes to the people and says, everyone, I have news for you. You heard God speak. So they turn to their friends and they say, did you hear God speak? Do you? Right? So they're unlikely to accept that something happened to them if it didn't. It's what he calls, it's a checkable lie. And especially if it demands self-destructive behavior. What do we mean by self-destructive? We mean restricting. I mean, self-destructive, perhaps you can say circumcision, but beyond that, the laws of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, leave your land fallow every 7th year. Well, it's not a bad idea to give a sabbatical for your fields, but for everyone to do it in the same year, that doesn't sound like a smart idea. We should switch off years. Everybody should do it at different years. But the Torah says everybody should do it in the same year, and that's what they did, right? And that's pretty self-destructive. But that's what they did. So to accept something that is checkable, especially that demands self-destructive behavior. So he says even critics who posit that the Torah is fictional and is man-made reject Moses' theory. Now, again, it's not proving here, as I said. It's possible. It's possible that they could have been duped. It's not likely, I think, but maybe if you look at the Sinai revelation on its own, right? Thunder and lightning, maybe they thought they heard God speak and they didn't really. Maybe if you look at that on its own, maybe you could say that they were tricked and it never happened. But if you look at all the events that that are happening all together, you look at the 10 plagues in Egypt, you look at the splitting of the sea, you look at the manna that fell every day in the desert. So Moshe comes to the people and he tells them that not only did you hear God speak, but God brought 10 plagues and he gave consistently manna every day in the desert and he split the sea like that. You're not going to be able to convince people of that unless they actually saw it. So all in all, with all of that together, it seems very unlikely that again, is it absolute proof? I don't know if I would go that far, but again, we're trying to figure out what's more probable. Is this really something that we should entertain, or is it very improbable that it happened this way? So even those who reject the Jewish faith, reject the idea that God gave us the Torah, they also reject Moses' theory. They prefer Fred theory, or other, whatever they would call it, past theory. But let's talk a little bit about past theory. Now, the truth is that this is where the Kuzari argument, the Kuzari principle, as presented by Rabbi Gottlieb, will meet its greatest difficulty. I think in the present theory, so the principle is very strong, right? You can't. If there would be available evidence, especially if it was something that we would have experienced ourselves, he split the sea, really? Why does nobody think that he split the sea? Like he talked to us, really? Like nobody, right? So that's something that we could check, and we wouldn't believe if it hadn't happened. So there, the principle stands very strong. The more difficulty is whether it stands in the face of past theory. So before we read this and talk about what Rabbi Kellerman says about it, we could just think about it in terms of what the scenario would have looked like, and whether we think that it is at all plausible that somebody could have come later and convinced a group of people of this. So how would it have worked? So we would need Fred, we would need a charismatic leader, and he comes to the people and he said, God spoke not to you. He doesn't, right? He can't say that. It's not present. He's talking about in the past. God spoke to your ancestors. He gave them the Torah. They carried the Jewish tradition for a time. Now, let's say like this. So we have to give a couple versions of it. And he gave them the Jewish tradition. So, and by the way, because it says in the Torah also, and he instructed them to teach their children about it. So this charismatic leader comes to this generation and he tells them that. So they say, well, how come we've never heard of it? So that's really where it's going to run into the Kuzari principle. So the Kuzari principle will argue, well, the fact that we have never heard of it, such a significant event, it must not have happened. If such a thing had happened to our ancestors, we would know about it. And if we don't know about it, then it must not have happened. Something so important, in particular, because the Torah says over and over again about different things, you have to tell your children, you have to tell your children, you have to have a Seder every year and tell them about the Exodus. We learned the first week, the first thing we did in this course was that the Torah says about the Mount Sinai, it says, you should tell your children what happened. And it says this about many things. So in general, about the Torah itself, teach it to your children. So if someone would come to a very charismatic person, but he comes and he tries to convince a whole group, the whole society, that their ancestors, and he identifies the people, because he's not saying there was a group. If you say there was a group that once heard, but it has nothing to do with you, so then it's believable because you don't know who those people are. There's no way to check it, and that's believable. That's why we have certain examples in the Christian Bible of great miracles, but now could be that they happened. I'm not, But on the other hand, it doesn't clearly say, it says there were a lot of people there, but we don't know who they were. We don't know who their children are. We don't know who their grandchildren are. There's no way to check that. As opposed to this would have to be that somebody came to a group of people and said, your ancestors experienced something amazing, unbelievable, that they would never forget, and the memory of it would never be forgotten, but it was forgotten. So that's where the Kuzari principle would say that that's checkable, and therefore nobody would have been able to convince an entire society that something like that happened. Now, that's what the Kuzari principle will say. But let's say for a moment, let's assume, no, let's just imagine, again, people are gullible. Let's say we can move past that rule and say somehow that people could be convinced that, right? Imagine again, it never happened, and it was a charismatic leader, and he came along and he convinced the Jewish people, he convinced the whole society that their ancestors stood at Sinai and experienced unbelievable things and were given a Torah, and then it was forgotten, and he picked it up, and he had a prophecy, and he's telling it to you now and reminding everyone what actually happened. So Rabbi Kellerman says, but there's a major problem with that version of events, besides for what we've already said. And that is, a major problem with this theory, and now I'm reading the screen, is we've never heard of Fred or his heroic resurrection of Judaism. Certainly, one of the most significant events in Jewish history would have been the fumble, when world Jewry forgot that there were 3 million prophets, and the recovery, that's a football reference, the recovery, picking up the football again, when Fred reminded the Jews about the national prophecy at Mount Sinai. Yet in an otherwise comprehensive Jewish history, we find no mention of such a claim. So if it's true that there was a point in time where the Jewish tradition was forgotten, and then an amazing prophet came and saved Judaism by teaching us what actually happened, if that's what happened, or if that's the claim that that's what happened, well, who's Fred? Why have we never heard of him? Why have we never heard of this great savior of the Jewish people? We've heard we know about Moses, definitely, number one on our list, right, in Jewish history. We know that Joshua brought the Jewish people into Israel. We know about David, King David, and how he slew Goliath. We know that story. We know how Solomon, King Shlomo, built the temple. We know about how Ezra brought the Jews back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. We know that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, was the one who composed and collected the teachings of the Mishnah, and we know who the authors were of the Talmud. We know Maimonides, we know Nachmanides, Ramban, we know Rashi, we know hundreds of medieval commentators and later commentators, and all the great Jews of our history. Is it possible that we don't know number two on the list? This guy, this Fred, would be number two in Jewish history. Moses would be number one, and Fred would be number two in our history if this had actually happened that way. If it had actually played out, that a charismatic leader had come along after everyone had forgotten about the Torah, or that was his claim, right? Because we're imagining that it never happened. If the Torah had never been given at Sinai, and only later a charismatic leader came along and convinced them that it had actually happened when it had never happened, wouldn't we know who that person was? Because his whole claim would be that he's saving Judaism, he's bringing it back. That would be a very important point in our history. And the fact that we have no record of such a thing is very strong evidence that that's because that thing never happened, because there's an unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to Sinai, and that those events actually happened. So Fred theory is not a great theory. So we've basically gotten rid of number two, right? If we go back to our original list of three things, three possibilities. So number one was the belief arose because it actually happened. Number two was it didn't actually happen, but someone managed to convince an entire society that it did happen. Well, we said there's two possibilities, either past, either present theory, that happened at the time. And that seems very, very unlikely that you could convince a whole group of people that they experienced they witnessed the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea and ate manna in the desert for 38 years and experienced the Sinai revelation and many other miracles when they hadn't actually experienced that. very unlikely to convince the people that they have experiences that they don't have, and so many people. And if it was past theory, if it was Fred theory, well, who's Fred? So it seems like that is not really an option. So we've gotten rid of number 2. But what about number 3? Number 3 is it didn't happen, but something happened, like a volcanic eruption. And over time, the story changed and the myth emerged. Maybe there was just a bunch of mistakes, or not even mistakes, right? Things happened to Jews in the desert, whatever it was, and we have an ancient history. And over time, the stories get, exaggerated. And eventually there was a book composed of the Torah that had all these stories. So including a mass revelation where everyone experienced prophecy. So here's the problem with number 3. The problem with number 3, says Rabbi Kalman, the ultimate attack on both Moses and Fred theories, and he's actually not addressing number 3, but he also addresses number 3, more importantly, and actually Rabbi Gottlieb uses the same idea to attack number 3. So this really takes care of all the theories, besides for that it actually happened, as follows. Physicists believe that the laws of nature are constant and can be depended upon, and that therefore natural events will reoccur. Indeed, when faced with a phenomenon that cannot be naturally duplicated, scientists and historians doubt it ever transpired naturally in the first place. The axiom that natural events reoccur is translated by historians into the principle, history repeats itself. So in science, in order to prove an experiment, or in order, to not disprove it, we have to be able to repeat the effect. And we understand that that's natural. If two chemicals combine to produce the same effect, so then we know that's natural, and that's how things work. And the same thing is true with history. That's why we find that history repeats itself. Since history is the story of natural creatures interacting according to natural laws, we expect and do find the same sort of human experiences and responses happening over and over again. And therefore, that's what we find in all the religions throughout history. There's a very limited number of different claims that religions make, and they all make them over and over again. The founders of all the different religions, they've interacted with gods, with the sun, the moon, the stars, etc., nature. Individuals will make a claim that they were visited by the dead or by an alien, or they claim divinity or reincarnation. Basically, the same things we see repeated over and over again in different religions, because that's the way of the world. Is history repeats itself. Natural events. This is natural creatures interacting according to natural laws. The details will sometimes vary, but the basic stories are oft repeated over and over again in the thousands of religions that have existed throughout known history. Except for one. There's one claim that we don't find repeated in any other religion, and that is the claim of mass revelation, of mass prophecy that Judaism claims. And in fact, the Torah itself sort of makes this point. The Torah itself writes, oh, that's not it. Did I end up including it? Whoops, going the wrong way. I may not have included it. Okay, in any event, the Torah itself says in Deuteronomy, chapter 4, it says, you might inquire about times long past, going back to the time God created man on earth, exploring one end of the heavens to the other. You'll look all over the world. You look all the way back in time, the Torah says, and see if anything as great as this has ever happened, or if the like has ever been heard. Has any nation ever heard God speaking out of fire as you have and still survived? Is there any nation that has ever, as a nation, heard God speak? And the answer is no. This is the type of claim that is not crazy, meaning if it's a claim that anybody would want to make, right? The claim of mass revelation. Isn't it the best type of claim to start a religion? If you want to jumpstart a new religion, you want to convince people? What's better to convince people than to convince them of than to tell them that a mass revelation occurred. What's better? If I tell you one person heard or 1 million people heard something? The much better claim is that 1 million people heard something. The problem is that that claim can never be made successfully unless it actually happened. And that's why we don't find that anybody makes that claim. But the theories of myth formation or a Fred theory or Moses theory are basically claiming that nothing supernatural happened, that this was natural. This can happen without a God, without intervention. A religion can start, a person can convince people a charismatic leader, or through, legend, through stories, through natural occurrences, through a volcano eruption, you can arrive eventually at such lore and such legends. And that could be how it started. That's the claim. So the question then is, if such a thing could occur naturally, then why is there no other example of it in the world? Did no other, over thousands of years, there should be many times that a large group of people saw a volcanic eruption. Never did it develop into if it's natural for such a thing to develop into a myth of a mass revelation, then why did it never happen besides for this one time? If it's natural for a charismatic leader, a Fred, to come along and convince a group of people that their ancestors once experienced mass revelation, and that's possible, and it's in the normal way of the world that can happen, then why hasn't it happened besides to the Jewish people? And the answer is one of two possibilities. Either it's extremely unique, but it somehow managed to happen one time in all of history, but it was natural and organic and there was no God involved in it. It was just a charismatic leader. It was just a myth that formed over time. And there's just one example, even though other religions, we find just the same ideas repeated over and over again. Or maybe, just maybe, this was a supernatural event. This was a one-time thing. God did speak to the Jewish people at Sinai, and it's only happened once in history that there's been a revelation such as this. So that is the disproof, for the disproof of the third theory of myth formation, as well as it also takes care of the first two theories. And again, it's not in itself a proof. It doesn't prove everything, but now it's up to us to weigh. Does this support my faith? Again, if somebody hears this, will they all of a sudden decide, Rabbi, you're making some good points, that's it, and change my life forever right now? I don't know. But for us, right, when we're working on our faith, hopefully, so I think that these ideas can be helpful for us to just to have another thing to, on one of the hard days, or just in general, just to have a little more basis, a little bit more support for that which we believe in. We can see that of the three possibilities, it's very fair to suggest that the most probable of the three possibilities is that, in fact, a supernatural event occurred. And the reason why we have a tradition that our ancestors heard God speak at Sinai and all witness prophecy is because, in fact, they did all hear God speak at Sinai and witness prophecy. All right, and we will stop there.